with a scientific manner. I approach this all with as scientific as possible. I'm putting on this presentation with my senators and my congressmen in mind. It's a government of and for and by the people. So refusal to participate in politics is willingness to be governed by your inferiors. So I believe that I'm putting this together so that I can give people who are new to this subject a very clear and thorough debriefing and understanding of what's involved and the research that I believe should be going into this Senate Select Intelligence Committee's Unidentified Aerial Phenomenon Task Force report that's due to come out in June. So I'm going to give you a list and summary of topics that I will be covering in this report, which I hope that are included or should be included in a thorough and comprehensive summary on UAP if the government is so willing and so inclined to actually tell us the truth and dig into some of this stuff. So hopefully they are willing and able to do that. This is going to be, we're going to start with history. So start way back in the beginning. And this, I guess we could start in 1900, 1930. I could probably, we go back a little bit further than that and some of this later on. But two very important things happened at the turn of the century. The invention of quantum mechanics and Einstein's relativity theories, special and general relativity. And with new physics comes new technology. The advent of radio, radar, cell phones, all of our modern communications technologies are based on quantum mechanics. And that science allowed for many of these technologies to take place. In 1939, Einstein and Leo Szilard, along with Edward Teller and Eugene Wigner, they wrote a letter to President Roosevelt warning him of the advances of Chinese, not the Chinese, but the Germans would be pursuing nuclear weapons, and that they would soon have an atomic bomb, and that the U.S. should act immediately and start their own project to beat the Germans in inventing an atomic bomb. And so the Manhattan Project was started by Leslie Groves. 400,000 personnel were involved in this top secret program. I'm going to remove my video capture device now so you guys can see all my slides. There was not without any accident or human cost. Louis Slotin died in an accident with the Demon Corps during the development of the Manhattan Project. But they were successful in the Trinity test, and then later they dropped bombs which ended World War II. It's arguable that nuclear physics has made the world a safer place, although it's made the world a quite dirty place at the same time. Our nuclear legacy is left behind a lot of radioactive waste and stuff that we're still cleaning up. And arguably this time period with these nuclear blasts sending high energy gamma radiation far out into the cosmos, it's basically announced to our arrival at the atomic age to everything else that might be out there in the universe listening. So it's kind of an interesting era. What happened in the post-World War II era, there was the Cold War, an arms race, and a space race. The Operation Paperclip had captured most of the Nazi scientists that they could, the ones that the Soviets and others didn't get. So they brought a lot of these Nazi scientists to the U.S. to work for the United States space program. A lot of them worked in conjunction with a committee called the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics, which is the precursor to NASA. And their immediate goal after World War II was to develop supersonic flight. And 2 years later, they achieved supersonic flight with Chuck Yeager's X-1. General Holger Toftoy was in charge of the operation, run out of Redstone Arsenal, which was Huntsville, Alabama. And it was run by a man named Werner von Braun, Dr. Werner von Braun, and his advisor, Dr. Hermann Oberth, Ernst Stuhlinger, and Dr. Robert Lucer, among others. There's a large list of people, but he actually worked with Walt Disney for a time, and there's some old archival footage from Disney of them sending these flying saucer-shaped craft to Mars. It's all in the history books if you want to look through some of that stuff. But Yes, they did work with Nazis, and yes, we did help. Intelligence agencies did cover up war crimes because the intelligence value that the Nazis had provided. Hubertus Strughold was chief of the aeromedical research for the Luftwaffe, and he did a lot of high-altitude testing on humans, on concentration camp prisoners at Dachau, and apparently brought some of these classified films over with him, which were used later in the high-altitude programs which were the precursor to our space program and the Mercury project, the orbiter project. But it's interesting that the U.S. government did go to lengths to cover up war crimes and to protect intelligence assets because they valued the intelligence over the fact that these people were war criminals, which is an interesting observation and something worth noting and looking into for the history of all this. 1947 was also a peak year for UFOs. This is Kenneth Arnold. He was a pilot that saw a bunch of flying saucers. What he described as flying saucers, he actually shows the shape of them as this V-shaped or wing or flying wing-shaped craft. But he called them flying saucers, and the term stuck. And a couple months later, or weeks later, the famous Roswell incident happened, where it was reported in the newspaper that the Roswell Army Airfield had captured a flying saucer on a ranch in Roswell. So how they mistook a balloon, apparently, that's the story that we've been told. Not everyone in the public believes that story. There's some evidence that both Jesse Marcel and Thomas Du Bois, the lead intelligence officers who are pictured here in the press conference office at Fort Worth with General Ramey, later testified that there was a debris switch, that they were pulled into this office for a staged photo op, and that the real materials went on to Wright-Patterson and did not stay in Fort Worth. The discovery of this material went up the chain of command, so it shows that none of these people were aware of whatever project this was or was involved in. It later turned out to be a weather balloon, apparently, which I would assume that some of these people would have had knowledge of, and it wouldn't have gone up the chain of command the way it was. So it leaves me reason to doubt what happened at Roswell, and I think it's important that we reinvestigate it and with specific focus on where those materials might have went. We have some leads. U.S. Navy labs, apparently Robert McLaughlin at the White Sands Proving Ground said that they brought in some of this metal. They couldn't, and they couldn't even drill through it. The drill would just heat up and it would burn out the bit before it could drill through this material. That you could fold it up in a ball and it would unfold itself, and it was mirror smooth and thin as the foil on a pack of cigarettes. There was a senator named Barry Goldwater who tried to go after what was called the Blue Room, where this material is allegedly stored at either Norton Air Force Base or Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. So there's some places to look for this, apparently, and they wouldn't let him have access. But I think it's about time now that we do have access to this, if it does exist, and that our senators should be looking into this. Another place they should be probably looking or asking questions would be the Air Force Institute of Technology and NASIC, which are both at Wright-Patterson, the National Aerospace Intelligence Center. So the Pentacle Memorandum was brought to light by Jack Villay, and actually it came from J. Allen Hynek's notes, who we'll talk a little bit about J. Allen Hynek in a few slides in this presentation. But the Pentacle Memorandum shows that there might have been a second Project Blue Book, and it was run by a company called Battelle Memorial Institute, which is in Columbus, Ohio. And it was run by Howard Cross at the time, and Howard Cross's name appears on a couple different interesting documents that show that he might have been involved with a top secret research program into the metals and recovered artifacts associated with this. So this is something that the Senate and our government should reinvestigate and look into, and not just trust the Pentagon and the people running these operations to investigate themselves. We need to hire an outside body to investigate these people and these organizations if we're ever going to hope to get to the bottom of this. The Air Force was created in July 1947. It was too soon after Roswell for it to have really. It had to have been planned for months in advance. They were already planning to create a division, a separate branch of the military for Air Force after after World War II. So they were already, this was already in the works. There's a lot of rumors out there that this started because of Roswell and the start of the National Security State and the National Security Act of 1947, which created the NSA and the CIA, which was formerly the OSS. So these intelligence agencies and this whole military-industrial complex, military-industrial intelligence complex was created and birthed in 1947 as well, which could explain a lot of this UFO, a lot of the UFO and UAP sightings and other literature, as you're about to see in this presentation. The Twining Memo is one document that's important and worth looking into. It was from October 1947 and written, I think, by George F. Shulgin, who was military at the time, U.S. Army intelligence, and they basically were talking about this Roswell flying saucer that was recovered and saying that they thought it was the Horton brothers. They said, where are the Horton brothers, and who's developing these types of composites that were used in the construction of it? And that was basically the composition of that memo. So they didn't think it was aliens. They thought it was Nazi technology, which, at the time, there might have been a secret space program with some of the intelligence that was brought over as well that shows that, the Vault V-173, they were building flying saucer-shaped and wing-shaped planes. There's a number of them going back through the history books. I don't have time in this debriefing to go into all that history, but there's tons of wing-shaped aircraft and saucer-shaped aircraft that they did try to develop. But the point is, we're looking for a project for recovering alien craft. And there was a project that some researchers have alluded to called Project Moondust, which was a satellite and space debris recovery program. But they would have also been the program that would have gone out and recovered foreign artifacts of unknown origin. Basically any space junk that fell to Earth and they didn't know what it was would have been, swept up by this Project Moondust heading. And it just makes sense that these people at the time, they were talking about aliens. There was alien stuff in the literature. So undoubtedly there was a secret program that planned for ET encounters. And I think that should be a focus of whether there was a group within the government that's done this historically, and what are the details of that group, and what have they recovered, and have they kept that information from the public and withheld it under the guise of national security. This national security state, which we again mentioned was established right around the same time. So this is the MJ-12 group. This is a famous pillar of ufology that is definitely worth investigating for anyone new to the field. A lot of it was proven bogus later, that the documents and the names and some of the people involved were, it was, quickly, this guy Philip Klass and Stanton Friedman have debates going back years over this. But it doesn't exclude the fact that there probably was a group like this that's job was to deal with the events or plan for events. They have what's called disaster planning scenario think tanks that they think up these crazy events, and they make plans on how the military will respond. And it's not outside the box thinking to believe that the military had such a group and had such plans to put in action with, precautions on how to deal with, extraterrestrial contact, aliens, biological alien, all this kind of stuff that was mentioned in these documents is probably a real program somewhere. And I feel like that this is like one of those things where they put out something similar, but they put obvious fake stuff in it so that they can debunk it and then say, oh, well, this wasn't real. But it hides the fact that there probably was a group like this that did this, and that should be investigated and looked into. The Joint Intelligence Committee, there's a bunch of theories that were Walter Bosley actually is the one. He's a former U.S. Air Force OSI guy that I've talked to that kind of came up with this idea of what JIC, why it might be majestic. It's magic, but not with a G, it's with a J, and why that might be a J instead, because the JIC might stand for something and be a type of acronym. So it's interesting that FEMA has JIC and FEMA lingo is a joint information center, which they use to coordinate during and after an incident, and personnel with public information responsibilities perform emergency information functions, crisis communication, and public affairs functions. So dealing with the press and media, and this is official FEMA documents. So that's something worth looking into. definitely their Project Moondust would have been a good guise for this type of project, but it should be investigated whether there were other such projects, and those should be declassified. It's been 70 years, for Christ's sake. Roscoe Hillenkoetter, the acting director of Central Intelligence during July of 1947, is quoted as saying, "Behind the scenes, high-ranking Air Force officers are soberly concerned about UFOs, but through official secrecy and ridicule, many citizens are led to believe the unknown flying objects are nonsense." So there's definitely stuff flying around out there that it can't be explained with technology. We're going to try, maybe. We're going to try to explain as much of it as possible with known technologies, and a lot of this stuff is going to be declassified in part 2 of this, which we'll get into once we cover all the history of this stuff. So the military timeline is kind of interesting. Project Grudge was started in June 1947 and culminated about 2 years later, officially, 2 years after that, 4 years after. But it was run by a group of these people, and this guy came in, Lieutenant Jerry Cummings, and he kind of revealed that the entire project was basically a joke, that the Air Force just set it up because, for whatever, and it was essentially a joke. They didn't really actually look into cases or try to solve cases or have any funding or any kind of mechanisms. So they established a second project, Project Sign. It was initially Project Saucer, and it was more of a like a debunking thing, So then that Project Saucer and Project Sign culminated. They had to go with the official one in 1952 called Project Blue Book, and Project Blue Book is the most famous one. But its precursors exist in Project Sign and Project Grudge, and those two kind of culminated to create Project Blue Book. But it's interesting. Project Sign was a more, I think actually no, Project Grudge was the one where they started first, where they made fun of everything. Project Sign was the one after, where they started kind of looking into, taking these things seriously. What's propelling them? How are they flying? And how can we explain these things, in terms of this stuff? And then Project Blue Book kind of was created, but there's this idea that Project Blue Book was kind of a culmination of Projects Grudge and Sign, whereby they had this surface one where they had this farce investigations, and they just poked fun at all the cases and tried to ridicule UFOs and the belief in UFOs and stuff as much as possible, and highlight a lot of the organic disinformation and other stuff, misinformation that sort of arose around these topics and these cultures that have been around for years, because there's a whole culture within ufology as well. It's a subculture or counterculture, which is interesting, but it doesn't exclude the fact that there was a serious part of this that did look into stuff and maybe had access to materials and things that were not made available to the public. And that Pentacle Memorandum and the Howard Cross stuff and Battelle, as I mentioned before, is where we might want to look for some of that stuff. The second progress report from Battelle in 1949 was contracted by Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Dayton, Ohio, and it was a document on research and development of titanium alloys. So right after 1947, whenever they recovered this composite material and were analyzing it, they suddenly became very interested in developing titanium alloys, and they developed processes, an entire industry invention around developing systems for purifying titanium, and also for methods for analyzing titanium samples by dissolving them in chlorine and then measuring the off gases to kind of see what they were composed of. So these studies were done by a guy named John Elroy Center, who later testified to his family members that he had been given materials that were, he believed, from flying saucers or from UFOs, and told that they were foreign artifacts and that they were analyzing them for those reasons. So this would be how the intelligence agencies would investigate this type of stuff. It would be done slowly through organizations like this, and that should be looked into thoroughly by a comprehensive report and analysis on this. There was the H.P. Robertson panel on December 1952 as well. It was kind of like that the part of Project Blue Book that was wanted to monitor UFO civilian groups, collect intelligence on them, and maybe even disseminate disinformation to those groups to kind of hide existing information about existing projects and stuff. which is interesting because one of the guys involved in that, in the H.P. Robertson panel was, well, Fred Durrant. He was a big CIA agent and involved also in, and then Luis Alvarez. And both Fred Durrant and Luis Alvarez were involved in the Project Mogul balloon train projects, which were later used as the cover story or whatever. That was that's the official government explanation for Roswell. Came from these two guys who were H.P. Robertson panel, like Project Blue Book guys. It's worth noting at this point some of the history of U.S. Army psychological warfare operations, because there was the Cold War, and certainly we wanted to, threaten our adversaries overseas into thinking we had some really crazy technology. So there might have been some of these stories and UFO reports and UFO stuff that was hyped up on purpose by Army intelligence to basically persuade, the enemies. And that I believe that might be kind of part of what's going on currently with the whole push. Some of the same people are definitely involved and are connected. The CIA had remote viewing and psychological warfare studies that were done by a company called SRI International. It's Stanford Research Institute. It was formerly the Stanford Research Institute. It's not associated with Stanford University, though it was in California. And they did all kinds of experiments on this remote viewing stuff. Project Stargate was this whole thing that these people were connected to. It was obviously it obviously didn't work because it hasn't changed the way that intelligence agents collect intelligence. We don't have psychic spies, but apparently it was worthwhile to pretend that we did and fake the Russians out. And there's still a number of people on the internet who actually believe that people have these superpowers, or people believe that they have these superpowers themselves. And I have not seen any scientific evidence for that whatsoever, and I would write this off myself as being, more psychological operations that came from that kind of genre. But I challenge anyone who has remote viewing capabilities out there to tell me what I'm holding in my hand right now, and if you get it right, man, then maybe I'll change my mind. But Mirage Men is an interesting movie. It's a must-watch, I say. If you're going to watch any documentary on UFOs to learn about this field, watch Mirage Men. It's all about perception management and how the U.S. government used psychological operations to hide top-secret programs and to also fake out the enemy for counterintelligence operations. Project Plowshare and Chariot were 1957 and 1958. It's back when scientists thought that they could use H-bombs to dig tunnels, canals, and small harbors. Apparently, they detonated a bunch of these nukes underground, and then a lot of the radioactive waste was leaking into groundwater in nearby areas. So they didn't want to tell the public about this right away, but they were monitoring it by taking random cattle and random from farmers and ranchers in the area. They'd go pick out a cattle, and they would cut out the thyroid glands to test for radioactive iodine uptake to see, how the radiation levels were leaking out into local populations. And people started taking notice of these cattle mutilations and started investigating them. And the government didn't want to tell people what was going on, didn't want them to find out, didn't want to have to pay for the ranchers for stealing their cattle, quite frankly, according to the history of the people involved with it. And they fed into these rumors that these cows and these cattle mutilations were actually being done by aliens. And they stirred up and fed those rumors about the cattle mutilations. They even dropped the cows from helicopters, cut out other organs to kind of confuse what they were after and what they were doing, and fed into the whole story as part of psychological operations. And that's in Mirage Men, and you can look that up. But it's certainly a more scientific and plausible explanation for these cattle mutilations than the idea that aliens are doing it all. But anyways, UFOs have conventionally have been used as a convenient cover-up for top-secret U.S. Air Force and Army and military ops. That's just a fact, and it should be considered when evaluating any of this stuff, that it could just be a cover. There were operations to build flying saucers. The U.S. Air Force had a VZ-9 Avro car, which flew on this wind effect. It wasn't a real anti-gravity craft. But we'll get into some anti-gravity research and later on, quite soon enough. Alfred C. Loading was a civilian engineer, and he worked at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base under Robert Goddard, and he developed a majority of the craft that you've seen pictures of that look like saucer shapes. He did a ton of research for the Air Force on saucer-shaped craft. So they were certainly interested in this stuff. They were certainly interested in flying saucers, but it kind of shows they never took off and figured out what they were, but they like to build stuff that was closely resembling them. The U.S. Air Force came out with the Roswell report in 1994, as we talked about Roswell a little bit already, where those real materials might have gone if that was indeed something else. And but the U.S. Air Force official story is that it was Project Mogul weather balloons, and that there were crash test dummies involved somehow with this to high altitude testing stuff and radar, counter radar and stuff. So that's classified program. That's why it was kept so hush hush. But then in 1997, Philip Corso came out with a book, and he was a special assistant to Arthur Trudeau and head of the Army R&D and Foreign Technology Desk. So this guy was a colonel, retired. Philip Corso, he had some pull. He had the right connections to the right places, and he came out saying that, we got all our technology from Roswell, and that all this stuff's been reverse engineered and slowly leaked out to the public. And that fiber optics came from Roswell, the transistor came from Roswell, nitinol came from Roswell, and he avoids all discussion on nanotechnology, which I believe if aliens have technology, it's nanotech, and we're going to get into some of that tech in the later on in this. But let's get over this list first. So the transistor diodes go back to solid state physics. All the atomic theory that I mentioned before, the 30 years that shook physics, quantum physics and condensed matter physics were really being developed during the 1920s and really the 1930s. And Walter Schottky was one of the key people that did all the theory for that. And so all the people that invented the transistor were using this theory, which predates Roswell. So it completely, the physics and the science demolished that hypothesis that we reverse engineered all this tech from Roswell. At least not that tech. The shape retention alloys is a weird one. It came from the U.S. Navy Ordnance Laboratories, which is why it's nitinol. It's nickel titanium alloy. NITI is the nitinol. Naval Ordnance Labs. But Frederick Wang and William Buehler created this nitinol metal allegedly in 1959. But as I mentioned, those progress reports from Battelle have nickel titanium phase charts and phase diagrams, which should have included this particular phase, which it's sort of interesting. So it kind of led some credibility. It should be investigated whether or not these guys, who they were connected to, and whether this came out. This is the one I haven't really sunk completely, is the nitinol stuff. These shape retention alloys are certainly an interesting material, and they're certainly quite advanced and could be used they're currently being used for a variety of aerospace applications. And NASA scientists realize that these materials are super important for the future of space manufacturing and space alloy manufacturing. And they're also used in the medical industry for stents and for other types of procedures, so heart opening procedures. But fiber optics were not. They can be traced back to scientists who died long before Roswell. And William Wheeler lit up his whole apartment with strands of glass fibers that he had made and attached to a bunch of lamps. But John Tyndall was the first to discover that light in a stream of water would reflect internally and wouldn't leak out. It would gradually leak out as the water flow became too great. But all the theory was there and all the science was there to prove that fiber optics. But it's still, fiber optics are super cool, and they might have been involved in the Roswell craft because, as we'll talk about later, electronics kind of have their limitations, and we're reaching this point in physics where we need to switch to photonics, and the future of all our devices would actually run on fiber optic kind of networks like this. It would be all fiber optic stuff rather than wire. But anyways, Philip Corso, was he disinfo? Was he? It's basically bunk, so I don't want to spend too much more time on it, but it's certainly something worth looking into if you're going to, cover this stuff. The problem is we live in an age of information, but we also live in an age of disinformation and propaganda. So it's really hard to find the truth in all this mess. And, you know, lots of different people who work information have different agendas and what they want to do with that information. So it's important to sort of step back and analyze, you know, who people are and what their agendas are, what kind of stuff, what kind of material they're pushing, what kind of material they're not talking about or ignoring or kind of sweeping under the rug. And, you know, I think it's important to do some investigations into those, you know, big players that are out there right now and see a little bit more of who they're involved in and what they're up to, if they're part of any existing or ongoing operations current that we don't know about. Interesting guys, these two, and the whole Stanford Research Institute with Russell Targ and National Institute for Discovery Science, NIDS. They did a lot of weird stuff. This Tom DeLonge guy grouped up with them, met with John Podesta, who apparently is one of the politicians who's super interested in UFO kind of stuff, and they linked up with this guy Elizondo, of course, came from this Advanced Threat Identification Program, the ATIP, you might have heard of, which was set up by Senator Harry Reid and Bigelow. Bigelow Aerospace he's a billionaire who runs an aerospace company in, I believe, Las Vegas. They basically took over all of the U.S. Air Force reporting system. So the Air Force had a division where they used to collect UFO reports and save them. And then they closed that whole thing, and now they just give their reports straight to Bob Bigelow and Bigelow Aerospace. He also got all of MUFON's UFO data, and evidence shows that he was remodifying and upgrading his facilities, according to several news reports, that he had gotten these contracts, like the ATIPS contract and the OSAP contract, and with his company BASS, his division of Bigelow Aerospace called BASS, which is the Bigelow Aerospace Scientific Studies Program. But yeah, it's right there. But they had modified parts of their facility specifically to receive and analyze UFO debris. There's several interesting reports that are sort of out there surrounding this, and we'll get into this in the technical section, which is coming up really soon. But he basically redid his whole laboratories there to make way for the acceptance of these materials. And then they apparently never got them. They never went there. News leaked out about it, and he didn't get it, or I don't know what the reason was, but they didn't get them. And then they closed down Bigelow Aerospace. He laid off all his employees last year in March, I believe, because of coronavirus. So OSAP and BASS, this is sort of some of the history of this. But, and according to these people and according to Popular Mechanics and the Senate Intelligence Committee Brigadier General Richard Stapp, Special Access Program Central Office, he testified that the mysterious objects being encountered by the military with this recent stuff were not related to secret U.S. technology, at least not any that he was aware of. But this is Richard Stapp right here, and I think that I prepared this report because I can tell you things that these people probably can't or don't know. I'm not sure, but I think it should be worth looking into the structure of these organizations and who's behind some of these things, because a lot of this information comes from a guy named George Knapp, who's an investigative journalist. He's tied to Bigelow. He was connected to Senator Harry Reid and Bigelow. He worked with NIDS and reported on a lot of the stuff that the National Institute of Discovery Science was doing. Bigelow was involved in this joint research study with Bob Lazar called the Zeta Reticuli 2 program, which is worth investigating. He had some things to say about that on George Knapp, but I'm sure if he was under oath on a Senate Intelligence Committee inquiry, he would have different answers. So that's something that definitely should be looked into for anyone trying to seek the truth about this. George Knapp kind of made a name for himself on a man named John Lear, who was a CIA pilot and one of the biggest disinformation agents out there on the internet and forums in the UFO field. He's had a lot of real information that he's leaked and stuff too. First person to really put Area 51 on the map. He gave a lot of Bob Lazar's story came from John Lear initially. They were friends before the story came out. So there's a whole history there behind the Bob Lazar connection to this CIA connection with John Lear. And John Lear's dad had some interesting connections, which we'll get into in the technologies part of this literature. But it's worth noting that all these people kind of connected to the same individuals. The ATIP thing kind of spawned the ATIP and all these programs that are being the center point of this UAP task force recently came from the same group of intelligence and military industrial complex connected assets like Bigelow and these and the Harry Reid connection. So what is going on here? And none of this is talking about the technology, and it's not talking about the older history, the stuff that we covered before, and what we're going to cover in this later. So it's worth investigating that these people may be part of, they're all part of the same team. They're all part of this tight-knit club. And what are they working together and doing to take the Senate Intelligence Select Committee, tell them all that UFO stuff, all the UFO investigation stuff is right here. This is the only place you need to look. And there's no secret U.S. technology that can explain any of this stuff. And we just don't know what it is. And we need all kinds of funding because it might be threats. And we don't know what it is. So it's worth looking into this a little deeper. There's a long history of... apparently there was there's a mystery airships of 1890 down in Texas and California. These airships were flying around, and these billionaires would get off and go into town and buy a bunch of stuff, and then they get back on their airship and fly around. So there's this idea that there was a group of aerospace people making Zeppelins and other machines and interested in this stuff that was sort of a billionaires club for this sort of thing. It's kind of a wild idea, and I was almost going to take this part out, but the fact that it came from a U.S. Air Force OSI agent, Walter Bosley, and his father was personally involved in the Roswell incident and debriefed on it in 1958 and brought to Wright-Patterson and debriefed on Roswell and a bunch of other things. He said he was brought into a secret space program run by two men named Wilson, who may have been connected to a man named Charles Delachaux through the Sonora Aero Club, or NIMSA. So that's something that, we maybe look up some stuff on this name Wilson. And I know there's an Admiral Wilson and some other things. But, yeah, we've tried to find the source of this Wilson character might be worth looking into. And it might be connected to the Orbiter program, which so many of these other people are connected to, including von Braun and Vandenberg. Hoyt Vandenberg was the head of Air Force, U.S. Air Force in 1947, and he started this whole orbiter project along with a group of scientists who would later form NASA 3 years later. NASA would form out of the Ames Research Laboratory staff, which was a group of scientists working out at the Ames Research Laboratories. They had helped Chuck Yeager break the sound barrier, and they were working on all kinds of other engineering challenges of the day, including a lot of top secret programs, which could explain some of the UFO sightings that are out there. This was, of course, a secret space program we know of called the National Reconnaissance Office at Vandenberg Air Force Base, where they launched the majority of the NSA spy satellites from. The NRO has a lot of different divisions and is definitely something, they obviously have spy satellites, and there's rumors that a lot of these spy satellites were not just, to look at our enemies on the Earth, but to look at our enemies out in space too, or potential threats out in space, and to monitor space for any sort of things coming in or entering the atmosphere or leaving the atmosphere. And there's a variety of space satellites and telescopes that have been built by the National Reconnaissance Office, which could explain some UFO sightings and also could maybe be linked to other secret space programs. But there's also other more crazy secret space program stuff, which, I figured I'd mention it in here because we wanted to be thorough and complete. So Project Serpo was allegedly, a bunch of these people allegedly worked on it. And although they're from the side of ufology that I tend not to trust very much, because they don't do very thorough or good research, in my opinion. So we'll move along to the TTSA we talked about, in these same group of people that are now coming out with medals. Apparently, they have their own medals from UFOs and they gave it to the U.S. Army under this CRADA agreement. All these documents, too, if you see a document up here, we have all these in a briefing summary. I have a summary report of documents. So if anyone wants access to those documents, I can get you the full briefing on any documents or anything that I mentioned. This is a very brief, broad report, so I'm going to cover a lot of material really quickly. And so if you have more questions about something that you see, please, you can email me at thealienscientist@gmail.com. And get a hold of me there. Let's see, thealienscientist@gmail.com. Yeah, don't forget to smash that like button and share this with anyone you can, so we can get this shared. That will help me in the algorithms, help this video get out to more people, so that we can get more people watching this, because this is important information, and I'm far from done. So the best stuff is yet to come. So if you're just joining now, you're in for quite a treat. So there's a September 1952 Denmark case, and I have the documents on this in the Debriefing archive, where they recovered metal from a UFO. Apparently UFOs drop out metals that look like this cone kind of shape, and they have this weird pitting and structuring to them. It seems like they were used as fuel somehow, and then used up, and then they spit them out when they're done. That's my best explanation for what's going on. Apparently, this 1952 case, a bunch of sailors saw this UFO. They observed it, following the fleet, and then they followed it, and they watched it drop this piece of metal. They went onto the site. They recovered the metal. It went through a chain of custody. Eventually worked its way somewhere in the United States, and who knows where it is now. But it should be included in a scientific study and a conclusive study on UAP, if one is to be done. It should be these metals should be located, and if any, where it went to, and if other metals like this exist alongside it, it definitely should be brought out and declassified and made public. There's no reason for it not to. It doesn't pose any threats to national security. It's a lie. In fact, keeping some of this technology secret could pose bigger threats, as we'll talk about. But there's other UFO metals. Jack Valet is a scientist. He's been involved in research into this for years, and he's gotten many samples sent to him from people that have had encounters with unidentified flying objects. And he has these materials right there showing that he brought to Gary Nolan's lab, and there's a recent documentary called The Phenomenon by James Fox, which is also a good documentary to watch for an introduction to this stuff. But apparently the isotopic ratios of these metals are off the charts. They're built out of they're built in really complex ways, and they might teach us things about nanotechnology and the science that we don't even know yet. But we'll get into some of in the technology part, at least cover what we know. So, Bigelow's UFO debris lab. So he had built this whole section to receive UFO materials, and then he laid off everyone in March of 2020, last year, right when coronavirus started. But space agencies have these sort of glove boxes and stuff where they can handle UFO materials. I'm sure they have facilities set up to do this, and I'm sure a program like this exists at NASA. There's no reason why it shouldn't, and if it doesn't, then there's something wrong. What is going on here? I'm just resetting the slides there. Well, the cost of not going to space is far worse than the cost of going to space. There's a lot of business that's going on in this. It's certainly another reason to be interested in and show interest, even if you're not interested in the science or the other stuff. There's business involved, and it's big business, and it's important because an asteroid could hit and wipe out our entire civilization if we all have all our eggs in one basket. So Elon Musk and SpaceX are doing probably more than any private company. They're quickly blowing up to be one of the bigger aerospace and defense companies out there. but there's a lot of other ones that are doing research, and as we'll talk about some of the things that they're building and researching. One of the things that Wernher von Braun warned us about is weaponizing space. He had his spokeswoman was a woman named Carol Rawson, who is a member of the Disclosure Project, and that's definitely worth watching. I have a video of her on my channel where she warns about the dangers of weaponizing space and what Wernher von Braun told her in the 50s about what the future would be, and it's quite prophetic. I'll just leave it at that. Signals in space. All right, we already talked about, we have radio. We're trying to move over to an all-internet society. I guess it would be better than using radio waves, because those radio waves have long wave, which broadcast deep into space. And we have a big ear radio telescope in Arecibo. I think hopefully they're repairing it. It suffered some damage last year and fell apart, but hopefully they're repairing that. It is important to have that. It was a big asset for SETI, the search for extraterrestrial life. Search for extraterrestrial intelligence. And it's a big ear that listens to all the radio waves out in the universe. And we did get a radio wave back in like 74 and a signal, but it didn't repeat, and they don't know what it was. It was just an anomaly. But we are sending signals out into space. We should maybe think about why we're, whether that's a good idea or not. Do we want to be announcing our presence to aliens? Do we want aliens to know we're here or to come here? It's kind of, we made a lot of noise already, so if they're out there, then they've probably heard us already, and I don't know if we can necessarily call them a threat if we don't have any evidence or intelligence for their existence, which we'll get into in a little bit too. So here's a summary of important research topics for the first part of this the first part of this briefing. Number one is the Battelle Memorial Institute. Battelle Memorial Institute currently manages all of the national labs, Los Alamos, Oak Ridge, all the big labs in the U.S. are managed under Battelle Memorial Institute. So they have a very odd stranglehold over all these scientific institutions and organizational structure of our science, the current science in the government right now. And so it's worth looking into whether or not they might have been, what's going on with Battelle, and does the public deserve to know the truth? Of course, we've tried to get as much as we can through Freedom of Information Act, but Battelle Memorial Institute is a private institution. It doesn't have to respond to FOIA requests the same as government institutions. So it can claim this stuff as private property and hold it out of public oversight and out of government oversight. And that's a big problem. Howard Cross was allegedly involved in a secret space program, and a second Project Blue Book should be investigated for being a potential member of MJ-12 or a similar organization. John Elroy Center of Battelle also should be included in some sort of investigation or report. MK Ultra, the School of Aviation Medicine, and U.S. Army Psychological Warfare. Again, the MK Ultra stuff we'll get into a little bit later and stuff, but it should be definitely something that should be included in the UAPTF report and final report summary. NACA and NASA and secret space programs, these Wilsons and this NIMSA stuff, the Sonora Aero Club, any of that kind of stuff potentially should be investigated and for if it holds any weight. The Roswell incident, of course, one of the biggest ones, and where to look for it is the Wright-Patterson Material Command and that Blue Room that Senator Barry Goldwater tried to go after but couldn't get into. It's time to declassify that stuff if it exists. The public can handle the truth. So, the Majestic 12, the Unholy 13, as another name that I've heard it called, but is it a Joint Intelligence Command? What was it? Was there a program similar to it? Was there crash retrieval programs under or adjacent to Project Moondust? Policies and methods for dealing with alien contact? And a review of nuclear testing and radio signals broadcasting, whether we want to continue to broadcast our presence to the universe, should all be considered in assessing these threats that were unidentified. Oh, come on. Why is it doing this, dude? I swear, Google's like, all right, let's get out of there. All right, so here's the technology part. Everyone, smash that like button if you enjoy what you're watching so far, and please share this so we can get some I'm not even reading the chat. No, I'm too focused on this, but hopefully my mods are doing their thing. Technology. Okay, so ATIP obviously was involved in some technology studies, as we know from a FOIA by Stephen Aftergood that got these 38 papers declassified that shows that they were researching, transversal wormholes, invisibility cloaking, advanced space propulsion systems based on vacuum engineering, and a number of different technologies, quantum tomography, ultracapacitors, spintronics, negative mass production, all these things. So we're going to give you a review of some of these, of all these technologies that were on this list and more, and dive deeper into that. So there's another more thorough document. If you look up Anthony Brigalia's FOIA request from Bigelow Aerospace, again, all these documents will be in the briefing folder, which are going to be sent out to all the senators and anyone else who's from the public that is interested in getting more information on this. So there's no reason that the public shouldn't have any of this. This is all unclassified or declassified. I'm a private citizen. I've gotten all this information through internet research over the past 16 years, and none of it poses a threat to national security. All of it should be released to the public and should be included in a thorough debriefing if everyone wants to be knowledgeable about what technologies exist and what capabilities currently exist and are being developed. There's a lot of disinformation about our technologies and our capabilities. There's a lot of bad videos and bad websites talking about invisibility technology, but there's real companies working on this stuff. There's companies in China working on nanotech chameleon skins. There's that makes these light bending material shields that can hide you behind it because it takes the light around and bends the light around you. But this is done with a green screen. It's not real invisibility. It doesn't work. It doesn't work live. But again, there's maybe some ways to do this kind of stuff. We do have ways to bend light and hide objects with using methods for bending light. This is an array of carbon nanotubes, which they run high voltage electricity through, and that heats up to really high temperatures locally really, really fast. And those high temperatures cause a temperature inversion or mirage effect, which has been observed in nature. It's called the Flying Dutchman or Fata Morgana. You can look this up. It happens when there's hot air up high and really cold air on the bottom. And the reflections can stretch out, or it can make ships appear like they're literally flying above the water, which is really cool. But you can also use it to make things invisible if you do it the right way. And there's stealth coatings that use these carbon nanotubes for that purpose. Here's some additional links and sources for anyone that wants to get technical on invisibility technologies and what's currently being developed and who's working on it. Lots of Chinese and other names, involved in this research as well. So there's rumors in the UFO literature that they were working on invisibility technology as early as 1943 at the Naval Shipyard in Philadelphia on something called the Philadelphia Project with the USS Eldridge. But it turns out that a lot of this rumors were started by this trickster and hoaxer named Carl Allen, or Carlos Allende, or Sir von Karl Allen III. He had a variation of his name for different languages, but this is an interesting case, but the science does not really solidly back this up. They might have been doing something with just Tesla coils on a ship to make it radar invisible, but certainly the stories about people being fused in the hull, there's no evidence to support that, or the ship disappearing or reappearing in other places, or the sailors turning invisible. I think a lot of this was disinformation to cover up what might have been some early experiments into invisibility technology, if it was a real program at all. The science of this, of course, starts in 1946 with the discovery of nuclear magnetic resonance with a man named Edward Mills Purcell. Edward Mills Purcell, after discovering NMR, would go on to head the CIA's Project Rainbow, which would map the EMF spectrum and all the electromagnetic response of different materials, and would develop wallpaper anti-Soviet, anti-radar coatings for aircraft that could basically absorb, deflect, or divert Soviet radar frequencies. And this was the development or discovery of what became known as metamaterials, which were used in invisibility research for the past 20 or 30 years now. So this is a picture of the first human being to be cloaked to radar to radar frequencies. Pretty interesting. That came from a guy named Nathan Cohen of who I met at MIT a couple years back. But there's also counter invisibility though, so you can actually tell if your photons are being manipulated, because photons have something called quantum entanglement. And so like if you shine your photons at a aircraft that's using a cloaking device, the photons that bounce and come back, even though they're the same photon, they're going to be disentangled, so they're going to break that quantum entanglement. So you're going to know that your signal's been jammed or messed with, because the entanglement will no longer match. So this is a interesting exploit of quantum physics that they're currently using. The Chinese have done a lot of development. This is a Chinese quantum radar array right here. I think the Chinese are dusting us right now, and you don't even hear anyone talk about quantum radar in the U.S., and it's definitely something we should be pursuing and looking into and doing a lot more research on, because it's counter invisibility. It sees around metamaterials. It can see you regardless of your cloaking device. There's acoustic metamaterials that were developed by the U.S. Navy to develop sonar invisibility. Nicholas Fang was involved in that research. There's an echo noise chamber. This is the quietest room in the world, up in Ontario, Canada. So if you're ever feeling like you need to get away from it all, you can go here and experience some sonic metamaterial action. There's also acoustic metamaterials. Inside your ear, there's a thing that looks like a shell, and there's also the shell itself. When you listen to inside a shell, you can hear all the noise inside it amplified. It's because it's an acoustic metamaterial. It amplifies those tiny vibrations in sound because of the structure, because of the actual structure of the material, not what it's made of itself. It's the structure of it and the geometry. Geometries are really interesting. There's a lot of research being done into chiral metamaterials and different types of metamaterials, carbon nanotube forests and these carbon nanospring forests and stuff. One researcher we had on, I have an interview I have lots of interviews. Some of these guys you can find on my channel. We've interviewed them. I'm trying to reach out to all these people that are still around to get their to get more information on this, to get thorough briefings on all these subjects, not just the short one I'm going to give to you here. But Ron Kita, definitely check out Ron Kita and Chiral-X. He's doing a lot of interesting research with chiral metamaterials and stuff. So not just metamaterials, but there's also the hollow materials and these things called aerogels and aerosponges and porous metals. A company called Luft Sponge that develops this I think in Germany. They have open cell porous titanium and 3D printed titanium that's open cell or porous. And they use this. They're developing some of this technology for bone replacement implants. A lot of your bone, the spongy material in your bone is kind of very similar to this in a material sense. So they're developing titanium implants based on this, so that they're more lightweight and while still having the same durability. Tantalum also makes really interesting cells like this. There's a lot of research that not just titanium but tantalum. And tantalum telluride, of course, forms a very interesting crystal called a quasi-crystal. And quasi-crystals were brought to my 51 employee by the name of Edgar Fouché, who talked about quasi-crystals in 1998. And I've interviewed him and talked to him. He didn't really have much technical information to share, but he did say in his presentation that quasi-crystals were the key to how UFOs work. And I don't know if he knew something more or if he was just pulling our leg, but it's part of the history. Anyways, it's on the record. Has to be included. Quasi-crystals, interesting. There's an article by Eric Quinones of Princeton University where he showed that you could send fiber optic signals. If you shine microwave signals at a quasi-crystal, they bend at 90-degree angles without losing any signal quality. So they'd be great for fiber optic cable junctions and also for photonic crystal manufacture. So there's a lot of interesting research that's being done into quasi-crystals currently, and also crystal structures and non-crystal structures like glass. which glass has completely no crystalline. It's completely random, but yet it's clear. It still has maintains clarity, optical clarity. So there's lots of interesting, and that's responsible because of quantum effects. It's quantum mechanics that's causing this, but it's on the molecular or structural level of materials, which are where we need to get to in our engineering if we want to understand how to build better technology. Amorphous metals or bulk metallic glasses are worth looking into. They're included in that ATIP and ASWAP list of studies and are connected to some of the research that apparently the Pentagon's done into UFO metals and UFO materials and construction and stuff. Glass alloys are super elastic and they're super strong. So dimensional crystals. Vanta black, it absorbs all the light incident to the surface and is the darkest, blackest thing in the universe. It's a forest of carbon nanotubes that creates this effect. And there's ways to make crystals that can capture light, bend light, and do pretty much anything you want with light. And light is really where we need to be going in terms of our, future devices. We need to push photons, not electrons. There's a lot of heat wasted in our phones and our electronic devices. There's a lot of wasted energy, and we could be running things on extremely low power. Just ambient sunlight would suffice for all of our devices. Would never need batteries or charging. You could just run them off ambient solar power, and it would work on spintronics, which is another whole interesting side of this. We talk about dielectric mirrors and Bragg mirrors, and they do a lot of there's a lot of research that's being done with materials that just layering different types of optical materials on top of one another, and the weird effects that you can get out of these and the multiplicative effects that you can get from multiple layers. So lots of research that's being done on this that's related to or could be connected to and explain some technologies that are out there, and how UFOs might operate as far as being how they might be built and constructed, and how they might operate, and whether or not this information came from just people developing on their own, or whether we had some help. That should be looked into. I think that we did a lot of this on our own. I don't think that we had help, but it should. I'm open to evidence if there is some of that, and I hope that this committee would find it and look for that kind of stuff. There's also 5D data optical data storage, like the Superman memory crystal. They can basically use nanostructured glass to permanently record digital data using femtosecond laser pulses. And this is being developed by Hitachi and Microsoft since 2013. So it's definitely something worth looking into. Quantum computing as well. This is opening up a whole new era of science. It's really just like I was talking about with the science, the physics opening up everything with the atomic bomb and what happened then. We're approaching a whole new era that you need. This is why I included it in the debriefing, because it goes beyond, it pulls UFOs and all this stuff together, UAP. It pulls all that stuff together because we're approaching a time where we might meet aliens. We could very well come into contact with aliens and alien technology, and we're getting very close to being to develop some really amazing things. I don't think the public yet knows how close we are, and I think it's important in this debriefing that I kind of give you some hints on just how close we are to this technology and why this needs to be declassified and brought out to the public now. So there's something called the terahertz gap in the electromagnetic spectrum. But you didn't know there was a gap in the spectrum. You thought it was just a continuous flow of frequencies from the low microwave up to ultraviolet and X-rays and gamma rays. But apparently there's a gap in the electromagnetic spectrum, and it's right around the terahertz range. And right now, a lot of our research and technology is into closing that gap and figuring out ways to make sensors and emitters that close that gap. And it's all about the material science and building things on smaller and smaller scales. So we can do some micro 3D printing. We can print some 3D stuff amazingly small, as you see these gears that have been 3D printed next to a match head. But as you get smaller and smaller, you can't just do it with the same technologies. You get to a limit. This graph right here shows that limit of where we can reach with our ability to build smaller and smaller and smaller, and then kind of what goes on and how the interactions happen at those smaller levels. But in order to build some of these materials that we're going to need for warp drives and stuff, we're going to need to build, really, really small. And we'll get into that kind of stuff in a second. So we know that there's a lot of classified research being done around terahertz and ultra-fast photonics. We know this because of a incident that happened in Ohio that I covered on my channel with ACE and U.S. Air Force. OSI was on this case as well, out of Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. This was a postdoc student who was working at Wright State University. Apparently was bringing some documents home with him, and he was under investigation for it. They got him over 1,000 documents in his house. But he was doing Air Force research on terahertz, and particularly what are called surface plasmon polaritons. At least that's what he wrote his thesis paper on. So we know for a fact that there's classified research being done to this currently, and that it's related to hypersonic weapons and hypersonic flight capabilities. Battelle got these contracts recently. This was reported on numerous news outlets. The Air Force Research Institute. Lots of interesting research being done into hypersonics, hypersonic drones, hypersonic missiles, and using these coatings, these specialized skin coatings, like I mentioned, are made with nanotechnology, and use a combination of emission, the ability to emit lasers, laser pulses, and they do this with what are called polariton condensates, and it's a polariton laser effect. And they use these laser weapons to basically charge the air. They can use them to shoot other stuff down for long range, but they can do short range, so they can just blast the air in front of the craft, which we'll get into in a second. There's also rail guns, and we're approaching a whole new future of warfare, and it's important to be up to date on the technologies that are being developed and used in warfare today. There was a very disturbing video that came out on the internet called Slaughterbots, about why we should fear and respect technology, and where we could be headed in the future with these drone swarms and stuff. And I encourage people to look up Slaughterbots if you haven't seen that yet. It's quite disturbing. Well, we're going to get into the propulsion stuff specifically. So anti-gravity research has a long history. It goes back to 1913 with a guy named Luigi Rota and Edward S. Farrow later on in the 30s and 40s, who was developing some other interesting stuff. But they were working on Jules Verne type electro-hydrodynamic craft, basically high voltage that would push airflow and ion wind, and use that ion wind for lift and flight. And then we have some, history going back to rotating mercury and spin gravity research that goes back to a guy named Henry William Wallace, who has some patents from the 60s, and kind of sounds very similar to this Podkletnov stuff with Project Grasp that came out recently. That's more well known. What's not well known is that Bryce DeWitt was working on superconductors and gravitational drag as early as 1966. So he was writing the theory around a lot of this stuff. One of the top physics people involved in this, and him along with a guy named John Archibald Wheeler, I've traced down as being the two physicists who were involved with a lot of the research into this kind of stuff. John Wheeler had this idea of quantum non-locality, and this idea of it from bit and observation of the universe, and how the universe formed. He had a lot of really interesting theories about how the universe was connected. This quantum non-locality was most amazing, and that the idea that space was an illusion or a hologram, and that we could find ways to warp it using that was his idea. And I guess DeWitt was connected with a lot of other classified research, like Thomas Townsend Brown was one researcher who was doing a lot of research into electrohydrodynamics and magnetohydrodynamics. But Brown kind of worked in the public. He didn't want to work on classified stuff. He worked out in the public, and they actually wouldn't let him in on the classified programs, but they were running a lot of these classified programs to investigate similar effects and similar stuff. But he was a public guy, but it was really suppressed and not really well known. And also it was, they have this whole thing at Bonson Labs. Oop. This is an interesting thing. I'm going to post a link to the actual video, the Bonson Lab video, in the description of this. You can go watch that at some point. Save that link, or it's right there when you want to go back. This Bonson Labs is very interesting. John Lear's father is in this video. Let me see if I can bring this over and show it. He's right at like 3 minutes, I believe. And John Lear's dad's in it. So John Lear's dad was there doing this research in the mid 50s into electrogravitics, into into figuring out the propulsion systems behind flying saucers. That's what Brown was trying to do. And this is the archival footage. You guys can check this out. But apparently, sometime around 1959, 3 years into the research program, they must have had some kind of success, because they can all be seen, popping champagne and having a toast after this one experiment where you can see the thing lift up and move. And this has led to a lot of rumors and beliefs within the UFO community, including people like Stephen Greer, who say that, our scientists developed this technology back in the 50s and have kept it covered up ever since. Which that's something that should be looked into. There's some articles that came out in magazines around the same era that said, gravity engines would be coming and that we'd have this technology in a couple of years. And then suddenly, throughout the 60s and 70s, they were still working on this kind of in secret, but nobody was talking about it or publishing it or giving any hope of success anymore. So this lends to a whole realm of conspiracy theories that, this has been covered up and sort of swept under the rug. But I haven't found the physical evidence or the breakthrough experiment to prove that. If they could do this back in 56, we should be able to do it in our labs. And we have a lab working on this. We have a number of labs, a number of different people, researchers all over around that have gotten access to all this original material and are replicating and trying to build these things currently. So it's a tough debate, but it's definitely part of the history and needs to be covered in this debriefing. John T. Watson was involved in gravity control research. These are then the Boeing Alzaphon experiment, which started in the 1980s and was concluded that dynamic nuclear orientation can change the effects of gravity, according to this study and according to the idea. So it was an expansion of using magnetic resonance and nuclear dynamic orientation to create anti-gravity or defy gravity. And there's a lot of interesting materials that we know of now that we didn't really know of back then or have back then. Spin glass. This is actually in the reports. They talk about this in I think the OSWAP report. But spin glass is a material which is very, very responsive to externally applied magnetic fields and the spins and stuff. So you can do some interesting things with spin glasses. There's a lot of interesting properties that can be made from these, including creating what are called meta-atoms or materials that act like a single atom, even though they're a macroscopic, large-scale tabletop material. You can get a tabletop material to behave like a single atom because of the dynamic orientation of the spins and entanglement, which is really interesting. Project Green Glow is another one. There's videos and pictures of this craft and descriptions of this craft that from Air Force people. A lot of this stuff can solve UFO cases, which is why it's here. A lot of these UFO cases can be explainable by our own top secret experiments and our own technology, and a lot of this stuff is declassified now. So we're just bringing it out to show what things could be and what they've worked on. To brief you on this, Project Skyvault and Lightcraft was started back in the late 80s. Really took off in the 90s. Was on a bunch of shows, including this show called Future Fantastic, which was an X-Files spin-off, which talked about the future, of us using microwaves in space and these microwave lasers to beam all our craft around. And it was a real, awesome vision of the future, but it never, it somehow got swept under the rug and got wiped away. And then we come out years later and find out, well, they got rid of the microwave stations. They put the microwave stuff on the craft itself, and they're using what are called laser-supported directed energy air spikes to affect hypersonic flow. So they can like a bullet will go through nothing. A bullet going into water creates all kinds of turbulence, and it will slow it down. And it's the same as any fluid, like air. So what they do is they zap the air in front of the craft, and they get it to create a vacuum through supercavitation with this laser effect, and that allows them to just blast through the air as if nothing's there. There's no resistance and nothing to stop them, so that it takes all the bow shock off the front of the craft and allows for supersonic speeds, much higher than could regularly be achieved by any aircraft, like Mach 5 plus, Mach 10, even Mach 10. This is Mach 10, which is incredibly fast. So the Skunk Works is one place that you might look for evidence of, developing craft that could explain UFOs, secret programs and stuff, what's going on there. There's a number of craft that were developed by the Skunk Works. The Skunk Works had hired a contractor named Bernard Hayes. He was a Caltech physicist, and he worked as a physics advisor for them on this whole idea of using quantum vacuum to and engineering the quantum vacuum and basically engineering gravity via the quantum vacuum. And he's written numerous papers on this, and he was one of the physicists involved in a lot of the classified programs that for Lockheed Martin that researched this starting back in the 90s alongside. He also wrote papers with Hal Puthoff, who we mentioned earlier. He's been involved in a lot of this research, both the real stuff and the fake stuff, apparently, if there's any truth to this. Or maybe this is all just creative guys to make the enemy think that we have this technology, but I don't quite think so. There's a lot of physics here that are super interesting, and there's a lot of scientists who stand behind this physics, and they say this is the future. Space-time metric engineering and building warp drives is going to be the future, and the Navy are working on it. It's unlikely that the Navy's patents and the stuff that they're releasing to the public is the whole kit and caboodle and kabang, but it's led me and other researchers to a lot of interesting information which could be used to manufacture warp drives, even if that Salvatore Pais patent and drive may not really work so well. Let me reset this. There we go. How's everyone doing? Are you enjoying this so far? Can I get a smash of that like button, please? And share this video with anyone you think might be interested. This is the debriefing that we're putting together for senators and congressmen to inform them of the history of the classified programs that have existed, that are now declassified in public domain, but are still not very well known about. Moving mirrors is mentioned in these documents for how we create warp drive. The production methods for creating the negative energy states in the laboratories that they want to experiment with, and these were what they came up with using the Casimir effect in this, where one of the plates is on a spring and has mechanical excitation, and energy can be pumped into the system via that mechanical excitation. So it's not free energy. You're not getting energy for nothing. It's energy in propulsion out. And there's a lot of debate over how this works, how to get it to work, but we're working with a team of physicists and engineers to really nail down the science of this. And there's numerous labs and people working on this kind of stuff around the country, which you could talk to for further briefings and information on this, and further places to look for evidence of classified programs on developing advanced craft, which could explain UAP. So energy technology, of course, is a big part of this too. I don't know why it does this. I'm going to have to just use the mouse. It doesn't like the arrows. This will be short. We've done some investigations into these UFO metals. Believe that what's going on is a type of cavitation, which is a form of quantum entanglement, actually. Entanglement is where I think physics is going. Is a lot that we don't know and understand about quantum entanglement. And quantum entanglement appears in nature in weird places like this, in ship propellers, where there's this super cavitation and these vapor bubble collapse or implosions cause this surface erosion in metals. And it's debatable whether more energy is released in this interaction than goes into it, and whether energy can be extracted from these types of interactions. And there's lots of scientific evidence to prove this, including some from SPAWAR, the U.S. Navy, which detected tritium in their lattice-assisted nuclear reaction experiments, or cold fusion experiments. And also MIT, this came from Peter Hagelstein and Mitchell Schwartz, showing that you need a 94% loading rate to get the right effect, to even get any effect at all. And the earlier MIT and Caltech experiments, which debunked cold fusion supposedly, actually were down here around 0.86. They didn't get the high enough loading rate, so that's no surprise they didn't observe any effect. But those investigations and the science should be looked into and reinvestigated, because there's a lot of conspiracy theories that the energy industries do not want free energy getting out, that this might be it, and they don't want the public to know about it because it would ruin their monopoly and their money flow. So there's a lot of controversy surrounding this. There's the field was announced dead 30 years ago. They said cold fusion didn't exist. It was blacklisted and outlawed from, you were a pseudoscientist if you even considered it or talked about it for 30 years in the academic community. But yet still real scientists who were actually applying the scientific method and not standing behind it as a religion were actually doing the experiments. And it turns out there's a number of them that are still meeting to this day at international cold fusion conferences. There's one coming up, which I'm hoping to cover. I covered one in 2014. I've actually met Larry Forsley, who's the guy you should talk to if you're on the Senate Intelligence Select Committee investigating this stuff, if you want to know more about the science behind this. Larry Forsley, I can vouch for him. He's a great guy. But he also headed this NASA cold fusion experiments that concluded in December 2020. So this is real stuff. It's real. It's potentially real free energy, and according to the data, it might be how UFOs power themselves. So the next section we're going to talk about, and this is the most interesting, I think, for sure. This could be summarize the debriefing for the people that don't have the time to get into all this. It's already an hour and a half, and I feel like I've barely talked about anything. So, technologies for faking UAP encounters. So this is key, right? So we're going to talk about UAPs, and we're going to talk about, people like Richard Stapp, who like to stand behind, and the Pentagon, who likes to stand behind, we don't have any top secret programs that can explain this stuff. Well, after this, they might have a problem standing by those statements. So, Jesus, I got to remember not to use the arrow keys. Okay. Technologies for faking UAP. You guys ready? It's a lot of information, man. I've been researching this for 16 years. I don't expect even a senator or an intelligence select committee member to know as much about this as I've found, because they're not into it, and they didn't do it for as long as I have. They might have some better access to some better sources and materials, but if they don't know where to look, they're not going to get the right information. And that's what this debriefing is about, is telling them where to look to get the information, because the people in the Pentagon are not going to tell you. MK-Ultra was the CIA's mind control program. Lots of experimentation was done, including chemistry, LSD and magic mushrooms. Sidney Gottlieb was the CIA chemist in charge of the MK-Ultra program to experiment with early attempts of the CIA to find a truth serum. They wanted to find a drug they could drug an enemy spy with to get him to spill his guts. That was what they were after. Frank Olson is something that this report should look into. He's a mysterious death. The mystery and the documentation surrounding the work that exactly Frank Olson did for the government, and why he was found murdered at the Hotel Statler in Manhattan on November 28, 1953. His family member have been seeking answers to his murder, and who is behind it, and still not found closure or information from the government on that case. And I think that it's very important, if we're ever to get to the bottom of this stuff, that a decade's 50, 70-year-old case now should definitely be reinvestigated and evaluated, and the truth should be declassified and come out. Even if it was one of our own agents that had this guy offed, it should come out and explain to the public why this man was killed for his research, which is probably what happened. MK Ultra had a subproject called Subproject 68, which was run by Dr. Ewan Cameron. He was the head of the CIA's mind control program. They did a lot of sleep room experiments. They were trying to develop sleeper agents. He would come up with these messages that they'd play for people once they'd have the brain waves on. So as soon as they knew they were in that deep REM sleep, he'd have headphones that would start playing for them these pre-recorded messages, and basically hypnotize, experimenting with hypnosis. And so their goal was essentially to use hypnotic suggestion and these sleeper room methods to basically create programmed assassins and spies. They wanted people that could execute their mission and then forget all about it and not have any information to share about it. The Manchurian Candidates. And there was a movie about Manchurian Candidates and a CIA hypnotized assassins program that came out in the with Frank Sinatra in the this was the 60s. So this was public, it's kind of leaked out and became public knowledge that these kind of operations were going on, but there's still a lot of controversy over whether they were actually used and whether or not they were actually used in real cases to kill civilian targets, including what RFK Jr. has called attention to, the assassination of his father, Robert F. Kennedy, at the Ambassador Hotel in California. The allegations are that Sirhan was a victim of the MK Ultra mind control programmed assassins program, that he was programmed to start firing at RFK when he entered the kitchen from the main room, and that the real assassin was actually a security officer by the name of Thane Eugene Caesar, who followed RFK into the hotel and shot him actually from behind with a pistol. And as the autopsy shows, RFK was shot in the fatal wound from behind his head, and the number of bullets fired in the pantry there exceeded the number of bullets in Sirhan's gun, and a variety of other evidence which has been swept under the rug for numbers of years because it implicates CIA agents in the assassination who were connected with this MK Ultra mind control program, and also to the assassin who was a security guard for Lockheed Martin. Thane Eugene Caesar, they had wanted to hire extra security for the Ambassador Hotel, and he got in there because he was a security guard at Lockheed Martin, and they needed extra security at the hotel that night, and he was hired in there from that. So the fact that he's connected to Lockheed Martin and aerospace intelligence, it definitely should be investigated as part of this summary report, and the public deserves to know the truth on these operations, and whether or not they killed a man who would undoubtedly have become our president for political purposes or what have you. The truth needs to come out about this. It's gone on far too long. The Montauk Project is something you should be briefed on. The U.S. Army Psychological Warfare Center at Camp Hero on the end of Long Island in New York, they built a radar facility which was it functioned under this MK Ultra Subproject 68. It was the radio telemetry laboratory, and they were experimenting, like back to that Project Rainbow stuff where they were experimenting with this. The CIA's Project Rainbow was experimenting with how different materials would interact with different frequencies of electromagnetic radiation. One of those materials is the human brain. So they were really curious about the frequencies that interacted with human brain function and human biological function, and about how to weaponize and understand those signals for intelligence and warfare purposes. A lot of stuff came out of this U.S. Army Psychological Warfare Center, including The Men Who Stare at Goats. That was a famous movie. That was actually a real program where they tried to use mind weapons, mind bullets, and it was the movie, the TV show Stranger Things. Was a lot of the story play came from real events which inspired the writers who wrote the scripts for that, because the radar facility was based on Camp Hero, the Montauk Project. The microwave auditory effect, or the voice of God, is a real technology. It can beam voices in your ear. It was discovered in '62. And they figured out ways to create energy envelopes, and so that they can basically create voices. They can create any kind of sound they want. They can create the illusion of voices in your head, and they can radio transmit this signal at your brain and make you hear the voice of God or whatever they want you to hear. And this is a real technology. You can look this up. There was something called Havana syndrome and directed energy microwave weapons attacks. These scientists who suggest that the U.S. embassies in Cuba were hit with high-powered microwaves, and they talk a little bit about how those weapons work. And there's a summary of this technology on. You can go to the International Commission on Non-Ionizing Radiation Protection, icnirp.org, and get a whole list of medical and scientific studies related to this technology, and all the whole map of the electromagnetic spectrum and where all the bad frequencies are and what they do. Holovect and laser-generated holograms are a real technology. Project Bluebeam was an alleged U.S. psychological warfare program where they, could create UFOs or, fake alien invasions, or a Christ would appear in the sky, or any number. They could have the God appear from behind the clouds. Allah. There's all kinds of different stuff that they worked on with generating holograms and both auditory and visual hallucinations, and how to generate those and create those for warfare purposes, whether psychological or otherwise. There I go. I hit the button again. So we're going to continue. The Tic Tac encounters. Okay? So there's a big debate on what these Tic Tac encounters are, why the U.S. Navy is using this as an excuse to boost threat funding for external threats, and saying that there's no technology in existence which could explain, these things coming up and going into the water, whatever they saw and what they could have been. So we did investigations of our own to determine that this is not true. We do have technologies that could explain some of these, maybe not all, but some of this stuff. So Project Palladium, T.D. Barnes was, of course, a former Area 51 Special Projects engineer who was recently interviewed and asked to weigh in on what he thought about the U.S. Navy encounters. And he mentioned two programs called Project Palladium, which they can use, which uses these balloons, these instantly inflatable and deployable balloons, which can be deployed from submarines, and they can be used to spoof objects that can, basically they float they would float one balloon up, and then they'd pop it and simultaneously inflate another one like a mile away really fast, so it made on radar look like this object just jumped or teleported, a mile away. And they would use this to spoof, and they were trying to mess with Soviet radar. It was part of CIA war games and stuff. But he also mentions the more advanced and adapted war games version of this, which is called Project Nemesis, which is also something that should be looked into as far as, this guy, he's one of the top Area 51 engineers, and he holds a lot of weight when he says, when they ask him about this, and he says, yeah, there are technologies that can explain it. You ought to look into it. We also looked into aircraft, and we found aircraft that actually, there's an aircraft called the Multi-Purpose UAV. Steve Cambion of the Truth Seekers show brought this to my attention last night, actually. I had never heard of it before, surprisingly. I thought, I kind of try to think like I'm up on all this stuff, but then I come across something I have never heard of before. And I'm really hope that there's people out there that find stuff that I've missed too, and bring more to add to this report, so when we can put together a real comprehensive report to go alongside the UAP task force that's going to come out from the Senate. So the Senate will release their report. I want to release our own citizens journalism report, where we talk about stuff that they may not be able to. It's a little too risque. So multi-purpose UAV, it launches from a submarine underwater. The submarine surfaces, it launches these this craft out. The craft will go out, fly, do its mission, and then come back and drop into the water, and will go into the water and submerge itself, and then the submarine will link back up with it with this cable hoist. There's a whole video on this, so you can look it up, and it will pull the craft back into the submarine underwater. And it fires these missile things, which look just like the little Tic Tacs. But also the Tic Tac shape of the Tic Tac is one of the easiest shapes to spoof with with other technologies, if you were doing this ball of light trick, that dot matrix array, the holovect stuff. So there's lots of other technologies that exist out there that could potentially explain what we're seeing and what's being tested, and if it's being tested on the, our own technology being tested on us, and then being brought to the Senate Select Intelligence Committee to say, hey, we need more funding for this stuff, when it's you've already built it with the funding you got, and it's ours, and you're lying to us about it. And that needs to be investigated and addressed. There's also modern airships, dirigibles. This is called the Kret Augur Rose Aero Systems craft. You can look up. And this one's even cooler. It takes shipping containers off boats, and it's an easier way of getting to a couple shipping containers. And it's a Russian aerospace design called the A600. AIDBA is what you can look up to find more information on this. So there are things that could be mistaken and very much look like UFOs, which can could potentially explain some sightings. We also have Project Echo, a 1960, and the Pagios satellite, which is the passive geodetic Earth orbiting satellite. The passive geodetic Earth orbiting satellite. It was a balloon satellite which was launched by NASA in June 1966. So we have both of these, things that look very much like UFOs. This thing looks like the craft from Flight of the Navigator, which could have been, mistaken for unidentified flying objects or UAP by people who weren't aware of these top secret programs. There's also JP Aerospace, which builds very, very large balloons that go actually into the upper stratosphere into space. So they're developing a whole aerospace company. They talk about they're the future of aerospace, and they have all these ideas for future space stations built on these balloon type things, and the balloon to bring you to and from it, and it's based on solar assisted buoyancy technologies. So that's pretty much a summary for the technology stuff. But we're going to kind of pull it all together here at the end. Talk about finding answers to the UAP phenomena, finding answers to the greatest questions and the mysteries of the universe. But we're also going to talk about declassifying technologies and using them to build the future that we want to have, and we ought to have, and we ought to be thinking about right now, all of us collectively. Physics has the answers. Okay, so I know what some people think about physics and mainstream science and physics, but physics does have the answers, and they are unlocking things, and there needs to be more funding for physics research and scientific research. I think it's super important that we invest in our future, because if we don't invest in the future, we'll really have nothing, and we need to listen to what the physicists are telling us. Quantum gravity is definitely the area of physics that is going to have the most technological applications once we come up with a connected theory, an understandable, a really solid theory of quantum gravity is going to enable us to build warp drives and all kinds of other stuff. There's people working on, ideas of antimatter and anti-gravity. Does antimatter fall up or down? There's a Professor Daniel Kaplan who's working on this. There's labs working on, using polaritons and polariton condensates to produce negative mass, negative energy states, and also laser emissions where they can, get condensate emissions, and it's a really low energy and really low cost to produce lasers, which could be used as propulsion too. There's also a whole idea of space-time metamaterials and the physics of how metamaterials work and can be used to create white holes or these event horizons whereby warp drives can be produced and created through these surface metamaterials and the effects. You can look up Jack Sarfati for some of this research. I got this graphic from Jack Sarfati, who's done a lot of consulting with the Air Force and others in the intelligence community, the CIA, and whatnot. So the Air Force Research Laboratories, the Directorate Command, is definitely a place we want to look for, the materials and whether there's labs that have these materials or crash recovery programs, and getting that stuff declassified and out to the public. The public deserves to know if we've, been visited or if we have evidence of this stuff, It's people can't handle the truth. They're not going to be total freak out. It would just be like a news blip, and their nose would be right back in their iPhone on Candy Crush. So I don't think it's that much to worry about. Lieutenant Arthur Exxon, Lieutenant Colonel Arthur Exxon. He's Wright-Patterson Foreign Technology Division. He's the highest-ranking military officer to date to say directly that Roswell was the crash of an alien spacecraft and that extraterrestrial biological entities were recovered and stored at a secret underground facility at Wright-Patterson. The Nazis were undoubtedly here in the U.S. working on secret space programs for NASA, NACA, and the Orbiter program and Operation Paperclip. But there's rumors that that the Nazis had some kind of anti-gravity technology themselves and were working on this Bell type anti-gravity device. There's also evidence that GE was working on some of this research in Valley Forge, PA, and there was a patent author named Henry William Wallace who had patented a bunch of ideas he had for using rotating liquid mercury and metals to produce these types of anti-gravity drives. There was a crash of a UFO that was recovered by the military and whisked away without explanation on December 9th, 1965 in Kecksburg, Pennsylvania. And numbers of researchers have noted the similarities between the Kecksburg Acorn craft and the Nazi Bell and its proximity to, Valley Forge, PA. The GE experiments that I mentioned before were going on with rotating mercury based on the Wallace patents and some of the theory by Bryce DeWitt. There's evidence here that might be part of a secret program, and it should certainly be investigated by the Senate UAP task force and declassified in full to the public. That they should be made aware of these programs, the research that was done. Enough is known in the public domain. It's time to declassify and come out with the truth. They've recovered something in the woods that I don't know if it was it had some weird markings on it, so maybe that was on purpose to disguise it so that people wouldn't know. They would think it's alien, but something crashed out there. The military came and got it. They took it away, and we want to know where it went, what it is, and what it was connected with. And we think I think this is the best, most valid, most intelligent connection that I've found so far to any kind of classified program or what ongoings at the time that could possibly explain this. Another thing that should be investigated by the Senate Intelligence Task Force here should be James Forrestal and his connections as Secretary of Defense. He apparently committed suicide at the Bethesda Naval Hospital by jumping out the window, but there's rumors that he was murdered there. And there's also rumors that long-standing conspiracy theories and rumors surrounding the Bethesda Naval Hospital as a place where pilots and sailors who saw UFOs would be sent for mental reevaluation. They basically if you saw a UFO or you saw something, they'd lock you in the psych ward until you say you didn't see it anymore, and then they'd let you out once you didn't. We agreed not to say you didn't see it. I made it all up and I imagined it. But the rest of the people, they would either keep there indefinitely or even run experiments on medical experiments with they drug them to oblivion. Apparently that's what James Forrestal was when his family went to go see him the last time. He was on so many drugs that he couldn't even function or pay attention or talk. And there's a lot of interesting conspiracy theories surrounding Bethesda Naval Hospital. Of course, Bethesda was where JFK's body was sent. By law, the autopsy has to be done in the state where you die, so the autopsy should have been done right there at Parkland Hospital in Dallas. But instead, the CIA flew JFK's body to the Bethesda Naval Hospital for the autopsy, and the Bethesda Naval Hospital doctors completely botched the autopsy, lost JFK's brain, did numerous things that were wrong with the whole, that have caused nothing but more conspiracy theories about what the Navy was doing, what this hospital was involved in more nefarious actions, and including the death of James Forrestal, the first Secretary of Defense, who was allegedly a member of MJ-12 and briefed on a lot of this UFO stuff early on, including Roswell. So it should be investigated. USAF Air Force Material Command Headquarters is currently at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, and it's run by Lieutenant General Arnold W. Bunch, Jr. Arnold probably knows something. He might know something. He does certainly be the person to ask. And if he doesn't know something, then someone their will. But I think the Senate Select Intelligence Committee would be a lot better at finding those answers than I would. The Office of Naval Research, Division 351, is another place I would look. Knox Millsaps. His dad was head of the Navy Research and Ordnance Laboratories at the time of Roswell, and would have been the guy to have had access to these materials and been debriefed on UFO materials if those did indeed exist. And Dr. Knox Millsaps Jr., being the son of his father, would have been also potentially connected to those programs. And if anyone in the Navy is in the know, this guy would be it, and he'd be the one to ask and go to. Another person that would definitely know some stuff is the head of the CIA's R&D division, which is a company called InQtel. And the guy who runs that is a man named Norman Ralph Augustine, and he definitely would know some stuff, or know who knows what. He'd know the people that know anyway, even if he doesn't know himself. Again, you need to ask what you can do for your country, not what your country can do for you. I'm not sitting around waiting for the Senate to come out with their own report. I've done my own investigations. I think I've done a very thorough job here of outlining a great deal of material that should be investigated and included in a Senate Intelligence Select Committee report into UAP. I've talked about a lot of topics, including back to the opening scene with this talk about this Roosevelt letter. Well, Einstein wrote, and all these top physicists wrote a letter to the president at that time, basically urging the government that, these technologies exist, our foreign adversaries are developing them, and we ought to get working on this stuff before they get it, before we do. And that's exactly what is going on right now. The purpose of this report is for, the scientists that I've worked with, culminating all of our scientific research to urge Congress, urge our senators, and urge the president that we need to start developing this technology before someone else does. And we need to understand it, and we need to make it public and make it more accessible. It's time for these secrets and this stuff. It has been in the shadows for far too long. It needs to be declassified. The public is ready for the truth. If these are drone swarms or UAVs or our craft or someone, a lot of this can be explained, I believe, in terms of our technology and our craft. I think almost all of it can be, although we need to be aware and cognizant that we may not be alone in the universe. There might be other stuff out there, and if this technology exists and it's in the grasp for us in the future, then there could be someone else out there who already has it. And there could also be our foreign adversaries that working to develop this as well, and could get it before us if we don't take this very seriously, as seriously as Roosevelt took Einstein's letter and urgent warning. So, a summary of the important points. We are most likely not alone, and very seriously in the near future. Flying saucers are real physical craft with engineerable propulsion systems. That's a key point. These are not interdimensional. They're not, they're not ghosts. They're not, portals. They're not weird stuff. They're real physical things. They can be explained with the laws of physics. And anyone who says that these things are defying the laws of physics, or that physics can't explain them, doesn't understand the physics and hasn't done the research, they haven't been debriefed. Military and aerospace companies have attempted reverse engineering. That's a key point in identifying those companies and those programs. And the majority of UFOs are likely man-made aircrafts. The Pentagon continues to lie about existing SAPs and push this threat narrative and disinformation through a network of organized intelligence assets, potentially TTSA, which is a lot of three-letter agencies in their midst, and is connected to this core group of these people that seem to be bringing this all back to the 1980s and OSAP and ATIP and saying that this is the end of the road. It all ends here, and this is all there is to it. And we don't know anything about technologies, and we don't know anything about other previous UFO programs. In fact, UFOs are now UAPs, so we're not even going to talk about UFOs anymore. We're going to talk about UAPs. So we changed the terminology and are basically erasing history is what I see this is going on, and it's not going to happen on my watch. The physics and discussion of the technology is kept hidden from the limelight, except for, you know, the people that don't know anything about them or are frauds. Basically, anyone who not to ask about UFOs is anyone who's not talking about the physics with other physicists. They're just talking about the physics by themselves, and they're not, you know, engaging with the other members of the physics and engineering community to come out to a, you know, an understanding of these things. Then they're not doing real science. And the people who have the limelight right now on a lot of these topics really don't know what they're talking about. And I think this is the most important point, is that government is necessary because people left unchecked will do evil. But the government itself is composed of people who are left unchecked. And these organizations and these people that I've mentioned and outlined in my report need to be checked and kept in check. And that's the summary of my report. And if there's any questions or comments, you know, I'm glad we kept it under 2 hours. That's great. I'm gonna go ahead and open this up to. I'm just going to leave it right there. I was going to open it up to open lines, but you know what? I think we're going to leave it right at that. And, you know, people email me if you think there's anything else I should include in this report. Also, if you'd like access to any more briefing information on anything mentioned in this report or additional materials or resources, please email me and get in touch, and I will be happy to send you a link to the document archive where you can download the briefing documents and all this stuff, and share those with. I encourage people to share this with your senators, share this with anyone you think who wants a debriefing on this subject and wants to know the extent of how deep this rabbit hole goes and where we might find those answers that we're looking for. So I hope you enjoyed this and take care, guys. Please share. And please smash that like button so that we can get, it helps with the algorithms and helps get this. Oh yeah, and again, I'm doing this all for free, you know. So if you want to donate to me and stuff, I'll put a Bitcoin link in the description, and where people can donate. I thank you, NM, for the super chat, for $10 super chat, man. That's awesome. I really appreciate that. It took me like 2 weeks to put this all together. And I've been working on it almost nonstop, so with no pay. So this is really for humanity and for, you know, the future of our civilization. Hope you enjoyed it, and please share and tell others to check it out.